My kids know every quilt shop across the United States because as we would drive around the country and there are signs that say quilt shop, I'm like, oh, we're getting off at the next exit. No, not another quilt shop. We have a quilt group that meets in Virginia that's been going on for 20 years. People have dispersed here and there, and so one of the people who's been there since the beginning organized this retreat. So we've come from Nebraska, Utah, Virginia, all over. So it's been fun to meet new people and reconnect. I'm one of the people who hasn't been able to go to the quilt group for a while. I had to go back to work. So it's been really fun to reconnect with everybody. Since my early teens.
How'd you get into it?
Both my grandmothers quilted. We always had their quilts at our house. I wasn't really close with my grandmothers, but I knew this was something they did. And then at our house, my mother always quilted, but old school. So there was often a quilt leaning up against the wall or taking up all of the living room on 1x2s and C-clamps so that we could hand quilt it. I have stories of my dad going to my grandmother's quilting bees, which aren't really a thing anymore, but he was the naughty little boy underneath bumping the quilt to try to mess up the ladies. So it's kind of been interwoven into my life for a long time. And when I started, I only did baby quilts for other people. It's always been that thing that you did for service, right? Someone's sad, someone's got a life change, you make them a quilt. It was probably 20 years before I made a quilt that I kept at my house. But when I started, I was determined to do it all very traditionally, and I did everything by hand. So I did piecing with old school templates, I hand pieced everything, I hand quilted, I hand bound, and probably 10 years into that, I realized I might be able to make more than one quilt a year if I at least use the machine to do the piecing. Oh, I've never thought about that. I don't know, a couple hundred, easily. And nothing makes me happier. I have a couple of families that I've made multiple sets of quilts for their kids because they bring you this shredded, extra loved piece of fabric that used to be a quilt. And what do you say to the 10-year-old who's like, will you make me a new quilt? Yep, I will. Only now it's not a baby quilt, now it's what's your interest as a 10-year-old. And then, now I'm gonna get kind of misty, and I have one family that now I'm making the wedding quilts for them. So it's all about that piece of connection with people. Honestly, I feel like Jenny came in and looked at quilting in a different way. There's a creativity in how she thinks about how you can structure a quilt. And I've learned some techniques there that just speed up. You know, even if I'm gonna use a rotary cutter, instead of cutting each square out separately, I've learned new ways to kind of speed that along. So I've liked that. And I will say, I pretty much let every quilt get long-armed now. I think now, even now, if I'm making a quilt for someone that is particularly close and I want that extra love, I still hand quilt it. There's just something about putting that piece of you into it that you don't get from putting it on the long arm.
Feels closer.
It does, and so much of you in it then. You know, I'm actually not very good at picking the fabrics. I often take my husband with me. I overthink it, and he'll come along and tell me what goes together, so that's fun. He's pretty handy too, so he does that. So yeah, I'm not so great with that, like, will this go together piece? No, it's evolved. You know, there was a point where those getting together as a group was your weekly therapy session. You're talking out the problems with kids. You're figuring out how to be newlywed. How do you be an empty nester? And now when I'm working, it's it's the stress relief of I can come home to something that I know how to do well, that ends up with a beautiful product, that lets me serve others, and just something I can do on my own now. Yeah, it's part of the family. And now I have a daughter who quilts. I have granddaughters we're about to move near, and I'll be able to teach them. I think it just, if you don't have someone in the family who can teach you, that's where the Quilt Guild comes in, but it's really awesome to be able to pass that along and be with them. I think you could ask any of the women who are here on the quilt retreat, and they would have some sort of similar story about either learning from a grandparent or a parent or teaching their own children and grandchildren. So when most people think of quilting, they think of what I always say, it's the strangest hobby around, because we take a giant piece of fabric and cut it into little pieces, then sew it back into a giant piece. But I didn't know what a whole cloth quilt was, and my mother taught me. She had this pattern, it was about the size of this table, that was a rabbit, and she would do it on it wasn't even quilting fabric. I didn't even know this was outside of the bounds of normal. She would put it on like a tricot, a silky fabric, and just trace it onto that one piece of fabric, and then we would stitch on those lines. And I know that's not a traditional quilt, but it's a core memory for me, sitting with my mom and doing that tracing and then stitching it together on those 1x2s and C-clamps balanced on top of chairs. So yeah, that's one of the core for me. And my first king-size quilt, I would say, is also, that was a big deal for me to put together. It's still on our bed. It's the people. I mean, I think in most things it's the people. So having this group of ladies who I haven't really been with for 7 or 8 years, our lives sort of intertwine, but I'm not there every Thursday morning anymore. But I know that I could call them tomorrow, and we have that connection. I could call them for any need, especially if I'm missing a piece of green fabric. That group will help me find it. But yeah, you find a group of people that you connect with. And for us, it's been in person, but I think those communities are online too. I know there are people who don't have a group that they get to every week, but they have that same connection with a bunch of people doing the same thing online, and it's a different world than what we were used to. It's not the same kind of quilting bee where you're all sitting around, but you still have people with a common language, and as you talk to them more, you share things like the struggles you're having with your family or your kids or your job or whatever. And I also really, really love the multi-generational piece, that now you've got, I even have older women that I can ask questions about my phase of life, and they're bringing their kids now. So we have this chain of supportive women. There's something about the creativity piece. There's something about, even now, I don't keep as many quilts as I give away. I think even if you're someone who, I'm not a particularly, not that you can tell now, I'm not a particularly emotional person. I'm pretty practical. If I give you a quilt, it's emotion and practicality, you know what I mean? Like, here's this thing that can be a comfort or a warmth, but I'm giving it to you because I care about you and I want you to know that. So it's all of that. It's community, it's also pretty things to buy, I mean, right? And creativity of matching things. And I've never learned so much about fortitude and resilience than when I'm sitting around picking out every stitch on a king-size quilt, which I have had to do. So there's just so many lessons you can learn too from all of that, the community piece, the process piece. It's something I really love. My name is Trish Ost, and this is why I quilt.